this topic that I've chosen is actually is something which I've actually not researched on for until very recently. And I tell the story. I was invited to a conference in Fudan University, and because at that time I was going to Zhejiang University, so they heard I was going to China. They invited me to participate in an international conference there, and they said I could talk on anything. But then later on, just a month before, they said I have to talk on Belt and Road, and so I have not done any research on Belt and Road, and so I at first I rejected it, but then later on I thought that my area on cost-benefit analysis and my interest in environmental economics would perhaps help in some way to research on the topic. And so I did, and I was quite happy actually that I did it, because I realized that while there was so much written about Belt and Road, there were quite polarized views on two fronts. First front is that, of course, China belts out a lot about how good the Belt and Road is and what they've done and so on. And then I read also the Western media and many Western writers, and they were attacking the BRI, especially on the sustainable development issues, the environmental issues, and all the other things. So I realized that there must be a middle ground. And so my purpose here is to talk about this middle ground. And my purpose here is actually to highlight that there are a few things which I think that China and the host countries of these infrastructure projects could do, and there would be a win-win situation for not just China and the host countries, but for the world as well. So here are some of the things I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to consider some aspects of it through cost-benefit analysis in particular, actually. Oh, I can use this.
Yeah, right click.
Okay, so to get an overview first, to get a picture of how big this Belt and Road is. Well, when you talk about the BRI, it comprises of the Silk Road economic belt, maybe together with the maritime Silk Road. It stretches across 3 continents. It involves 65 countries, and essentially is to expand trade, inter-regional connectivity through 6 economic corridors, and focusing on 2 aspects. One is economic development through trade, infrastructure development, finance, policy and people, and then doing this in an environmentally and economically sustainable manner. But we also note that before BRI, China has progressively introduced various strategies to protect the environment. And I've always believed that no government in the world would just pursue GDP worship, GDP growth at the expense of everything else. You don't want to wake up one day that you cannot breathe the air, you cannot see the mountains, you cannot enjoy life actually, but lots of wealth. So no government, including China, would just pursue growth. Now, since the inception of the BRI, we know that China has increasingly talked about green development, ecological progress in various things like conducting through investment and trade, increased cooperation, protecting biodiversity, and tackling climate change. Now, here are 4 main points which will take us through this paper. And essentially, for projects like BRI scale, the question is, do benefits justify its costs? And what I think what is needed is an inclusive and complete cost-benefit analysis. Second is, arising from the costs of the BRI, it is also important to look at the acceptance of BRI in the host countries and not just looking from China's perspective. Third is, environmental economics and cost-benefit analysis, I believe, are significant tools to provide insights to deal with some of the issues when we talk about environmental degradation. And fourthly, it is important to engage the stakeholders for public acceptability. The BRI, to give you the scale, covers 40% of the Earth's total land area, 30% of the global GDP, 55% of total carbon emissions, 60% of the world's population. Therefore, it's significant human development and covers significant environmental impact. If it's not handled properly, then the worst case scenario would be unsustainable infrastructure, technology and resource extraction with long-term impacts. And it also undermines countries' ability to meet the United Nations 2030 agenda for sustainable development. So there's a great importance to look at sound decision making to provide inputs to governments for both social and environmental safeguards. And cost-benefit analysis, I think, is a useful tool which has been around to guide this policy decision making, evaluating the contributions of both the output side, the input side, the cost and the benefits. And it's commonly used to evaluate major infrastructure, as we know, and also environmental impact. Now, I came across an article in the media when Foreign Minister Taro Kono, right? He went to the OECD meeting and that focuses on Southeast Asia. And he talked about the importance of the quality infrastructure. Because without quality infrastructure, you are not going to have inclusive and sustainable environmental development. And so he talked about how to have quality infrastructure. It's not just the building per se, but rather to focus on the principles of efficiency in economics, and also the principles of what constitutes social, environmental, and economic impact. So that was the thrust of his speech. And I think this brings to mind cost-benefit analysis as one important tool to use. I mean, whether you like it or not, cost-benefit analysis do serve an important purpose to provide inputs of information. Not necessarily the government may accept everything, right? Because the government is bigger than the tool itself. It has a lot of holistic arguments to look at, but the cost-benefit analysis serves as a reminder to everyone that we need to look at the efficiency of our investment and we need to look at it transparently. And so cost-benefit analysis has a framework. And just to remind you, some of this framework, let's skip this one, is we have to know what is the accounting stance, which is what is the reference target group. And that means that we look at global, regional, or country. We have to look at stakeholders. We identify the effects of the project. And then we classify these effects in terms of cost and in terms of benefits. And economic value is not just use value. You have to cover the non-use value, as you can see here for those of you who are familiar. And then we value these costs and benefits after we've identified. We use shadow prices when necessary. And we use a whole assortment of valuation tools, ranging from contingent valuation, hedonic pricing, dose response, replacement costs, and others. And then, because these effects occur over in the long term, we have to think about discounting this into present day values. So discounting of future benefits and costs. Then we have to adjust for uncertainty. We have to adjust for equity. And here we include intergenerational effects across regions, across stakeholders. And where necessary, we weight the costs and benefits. And then we evaluate alternatives and select projects with the largest net benefits. So my point is that there's a framework in CBA. And anybody who tries to manipulate the CBA will be found out easily, because you have to come up with the framework. You have to fit into the 5 or 6 questions that the cost-benefit analysis asks you to do. So if you choose an unusual discount rate, you have to defend that unusual discount rate. If you choose a particular valuation method, you have to defend the valuation method. Or why didn't you try another method? You see? So my point is that there are certain steps that you have to follow, and you have to make all this transparent. So cost-benefit analysis allows you to do that, and that way you get better inputs to decision making. Now here I turn to 2 aspects of BRI. One is the cost and the other is benefits, right? On the cost side, of course, there's heavy capital investment costs. trillions of dollars, looking at infrastructure, building, technical capacity, and so on. Then we have the economic and social costs. And here we have what the critics usually say: illegal logging, poaching, increased income inequality, trafficking of drugs, humans, and crimes. And then environmental damages. Pollution from chemical, from noise, from air pollution, soil desertification, the impact on ecosystem and wildlife habitat. The WWF, for example, have estimated that greater than 1,700 critical biodiversity spots will be impacted, endangers 265 species, and so on. Possible invasion of new species, overall impact on ecosystems, quality and functionality, impact on carbon emissions, and that feeds into global warming, and accelerated depletion of resources and raw materials. What are the benefits? Well, there are economic and social benefits, of course, because that's what the BRI original mission is. Global and regional trade, reduce production costs, employment connectivity, resource security, and so on. And the idea is to try to raise the overall social and economic standards of living. There are also other benefits such as goodwill and political influence. But people seldom talk about the environmental benefits. They always focus on the environmental costs. What are some of these? Now, from the China side, it allows China to draw on environmental experience in the past, strengthen the environmental legislation, national and regional policies. China is not coming in from the cold. It has already been heavily criticized in the past of not doing enough for the environment, and they have put in place measures, strategies, and they are testing out. And China is a big country, of course. Things take a long time to change. It's not that instantaneous you expect it to change. But it has built up some experience. And this experience can be translated to a wider perspective through the BRI. So with proper management, the BRI can act as a catalyst to spur China's sustainability efforts and then develop and formulate a framework for responsible development, environmental and social assessments. There's also opportunities for China to have environmental stewardship, potential for China to create impetus and help other countries achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. Also opportunities for China to consult with environmental forerunners like Japan, which has lots of experience, energy efficiency, greenery development, renewable energy, and so on, and how to synergize with the Japan's past efforts and expertise, share experience with the host countries along the BRI. And this would transform, if handled properly, the whole of Asia's green transformation. So overall, there's potentially a coordinated environmental and economic development, achieving green transformation for the regional economy. Now, the BRI covers many developing countries. Many, right? So, cost-benefit analysis is especially important to the developing countries. And developing countries, they are eager to grow fast, eager to catch up, eager to converge to the advanced countries. Much of the world's natural resources also rest, however, in the developing countries. So there's a greater conservation pressure in those countries. But developing countries face tighter budgets. They are poorer countries, limited funds. And so for them, there's a greater need to justify whatever expenditure that they make up. So greater need to ensure what should be the projects that is selected and what will be the scale of those projects. However, we note that developing countries are different from the advanced countries. And I've said this before here in one of the talks, maybe 2 years ago or something. And I've written a paper on this, and it's published. And basically, the idea is this. The cost-benefit analysis, as we learn from the textbooks, came from the West. The framework that we learned came from the West. The methods that we learned came from the West. But the question is everything what we study in the textbooks on cost-benefit analysis can be directly applicable to the poor countries? And the answer is not exactly. The principles are the same. The framework is the same. But somehow the methodologies pertaining to valuation, to discounting, and uncertainty, and so on, and weights should be handled more sensitively, should be perhaps have a different method. So conceptually they are the same, but practically some of the methods needs to be amended. And why? Because in poor countries or developing countries, there are differences in labor markets, goods markets, financial markets. There's greater income inequality in those countries, which necessitates the using of weights. And that implies the possibility of manipulation of those weights, and we have to be very careful there, and the choice of the weight system is important. The implications for cost-benefit analysis on valuation techniques is also great, and so on. In the labor market, there's lots of disguised unemployment in the poor countries, especially in farming, high levels of household production. There's inefficient labor market, incomplete. And so if you take wages as a representative of cost, then it may not be a true opportunity cost of labor. And when you do value of statistical life, when you compute, say, infrastructure that affects or threatens life or injures life, you have to put a value on that. What is that value? The traditional methods may not work so well. So if you just look at using the wage rates. The goods market is also different. There is less efficiency due to larger information asymmetry. There is, in the poor countries, a lot of distortion by taxes, subsidies, and other forms of government interventions. There is distorted values of the inputs used in the infrastructure development. And there is incomplete pricing of externalities, non-market goods, if you use review preference approaches, and therefore you need to correct them. And also tradable goods, when you use that as direct inputs, for example, there's greater fluctuations in currency and more difficulty in determining what should be the shadow price. In the financial markets, they are underdeveloped and less perfect. There's greater market power of the private banks and higher interest rates due to market power, presence of some oligopolistic banks. And so there are two schools of thought in the choice of discount rates. So if you use the Chicago school, which is the investment funds which is injected into the public sector, should at least fetch the returns from the private sector, the discount rate that is chosen usually follows that market interest rate, which will tend to be too high. So most of these projects may be rejected. The other one is, if you don't follow the Chicago school, you use a social time preference rate and try to discover the rate at which people trade off consumption with investment, then you're also going to get a high discount rate. Why? Because in the poor countries, their life expectancy is short. So in many of these developing countries, they don't wait a long time in order to get their goods, their return. So they want quick returns. So the discount rate tend to be higher. So both of these points to high discount rate. So based on all these differences in labor markets, goods market, and the financial markets, when you use review preference approaches to value your goods and services, the non-market goods, for example, you're going to have a lot of problems, right? Because you cannot take shadow prices from observing people's behavior in those markets. And because review preference also require rationality, near perfect information, perfect mobility, such as when you use hedonic pricing, right, as a form of non-market goods valuation. And hedonic pricing comes from observations of prices in the markets. And if the market is incomplete and inefficient, then obviously the prices do not reflect what should be the social one. So you're going to have a problem there. And behavioral bias is also likely to be greater, where experience with surveys are much more limited. And there's also always confusion between WTP and probability to pay. And if you use benefit transfer, in other words, when you're trying to evaluate projects in the developing country, or in the build infrastructure, and because of certain things you don't have the information, you borrow this information from overseas studies. You try to search and see whether another country has done a study like this, and you try to take the coefficients of those countries and you import them and use it for your own country. That's not very satisfactory, but it's an acceptable method, benefit transfer. But in the poor countries, obviously, right, if you are doing a study in Canada, you can borrow studies from Britain or Australia or US. But if you are doing study in Kazakhstan or Laos or so on, then wherever you lack data, you borrow. Which country do you borrow? That's the question. So the implication is that the fundamentals for CPA, both developed and developing countries, are the same, but due to greater constraints in the markets for efficiency, for education literacy, and time preference choices, the application of cost-benefit analysis in the developing countries requires a different approach. So all valuation techniques have plus and minuses. The government must exercise, therefore, care in the choice of techniques. So my point here about cost-benefit analysis is that, number one, it is, to me, an important tool to aid decision-making in the public sector. And since the BRI involves a lot of public sector, of course some with private sector, infrastructure development, financing, and so on, then the cost-benefit analysis techniques lends itself to all this infrastructure development to see whether they are bringing net social benefits for their society. And the reference target group is important because now the benefits is spread across not just, let's say, Kazakhstan alone, but you have to think of China and Kazakhstan, a greater reference target group. So for example, if you build a dam, let's say in southern part of China, and then you compute your cost benefit, your reference target group is only to the Chinese. And of course the benefits from there might be smaller, right? But if you say the dam is useful to control flood waters, irrigation, so on, along the let's say the Mekong River, and the southern, after China, then you have the other Indo-China countries. If you bring them into the equation, then your benefits might be larger. So my point is that the reference target group is very important. So when you analyze the BRI, cost benefit is important, but at the same time, you have to be aware of all the steps in cost benefit analysis, and the reference target group may be bigger. Of course, the cost will also be bigger correspondingly. Now it's a small digression, but while coming to Japan, I was reading a work by Cass Sunstein. You know, Cass Sunstein is a very famous Harvard law professor. He was the co-author with Richard Taylor on Nudge, the book Nudge. And he wrote this article about cost-benefit analysis is here to stay. And he was talking about the polarization between the Republicans and the Democrats. And he talked about, while they may have all these big differences, they all agree that cost-benefit analysis is an essential tool. And he looked at from President Ronald Reagan in 1981, where he issued the executive order to impose more cost-benefit analysis in public sector projects and investment to justify spending, to look at regulatory reform. People thought that after Reagan is gone, then the Democrats that came in would change everything. But they did not. They actually strengthened it all the way, right? From Clinton, George Bush, and then to Obama. So the point I'm making is that cost-benefit analysis, no matter how you criticize or talk badly about it, it's subject to manipulation and so on. It is a tool that has a long history in applying to analyze public sector projects investment, and it gives you a framework, a systematic framework to try to rationalize your decision. It is not the final answer that is important. It's the steps leading to that answer is important. So anybody who tries to be funny, manipulate, hiding things, you cannot. It's simply difficult. You have to surface your choice of variables, your choice of techniques, your choice of discount rates, what you do with weighting, have you talked about uncertainty, have you tried sensitivity analysis, all these things you have to surface. So sometimes I feel it's unfair criticism of CPA by most of the time I read people just saying, oh, because you can manipulate. What does that mean by manipulate? The second thing, and So if you are interested, I have the two books. One is Cost Benefit Analysis, which is a theoretical book, both published by Routledge, UK. The second book is Applied Cost Benefit Analysis, and the pictures show it. You saw the picture before. By the way, my slides are available. You can just pick it up if you want. The second part is NIMBY syndrome, and I've written this book on citing environmentally unwanted facilities, risk trade-offs and choices with Edward Algar. And not in my backyard syndrome, NIMBY, is commonplace across all over the world and increasingly become more and more in Asia. It's no longer a time where governments can say what they want to do, where they want to put any facility. Why? Because we have the internet generation, news travel fast, we have an more educated public, we have people earning more income, and so on. So in the past, government can just say, okay, I just put my facility, my infrastructure in this poor rural community. But now even the rural poor community will rise up and oppose the facility if there is some threats to their health and threats to their property values or whatever, right? People will rise up. So it's no longer a simple thing that you just site the facility. Now, not in my backyard just simply means that every country growing to become a advanced country will need certain facilities and infrastructure for energy supply. But even building an airport is like a NIMBY. A landfill to get rid of the waste is also like a NIMBY. Chemical production plant is also like a NIMBY. So if you ask everybody, should we have these facilities? The answer usually is yes. But where do you site them is a critical thing. So if take the example of Malaysia, they're having problems, for example, 5 years ago, where to locate an incinerator. See, Kuala Lumpur will never say, I want the incinerator to be here, I want the incinerator to be far. So if you ask the people in Kuala Lumpur, should we have incinerator? Of course they will say yes. But where is it to be located? So they had difficulty. They tried to locate the incinerator in various parts of the country. They couldn't find a suitable place because farmers object, people object, media came in, and global media was focused as well. So you see, it's not a simple case of yesteryears where you simply locate the facility. So in my part of this section here is to say that, well, NIMBYs are becoming common and the BRI will not be spared. And so if China and the host countries' government, they want to realize the benefits of the BRI, then they have to contend with NIMBYs. Because if you don't deal with the NIMBYs, you are going to get opposition, strife, you are going to delay your project, you can't build, and all the benefits will be delayed. So NIMBYs is something that you have to contend. And so you have to look at it carefully. Now here is where the cost-benefit analysis principle of using net benefits greater than zero may falter, may have a weakness. And the weakness is, if you do cost-benefits analysis on a national scale, then clearly the benefits may outweigh the cost, because the cost is an asymmetric cost. It's only to the local residents where the NIMBY is located. So the cost tends to be smaller than you look at the benefits for everyone as a whole. So this so-called Kaldor-Hicks criterion, which the cost-benefit analysis tool use, may have a weakness. So one has to look at this more carefully in cases like this. Okay, this one I think you can read. And of course, NIMBYs are not overnight phenomenon. It's overnight for us here in Asia, but not in Europe or in US. They are content with it. So maybe that's one way we can learn how they deal with the citing of their own NIMBYs. And I think we need new methods here, research on what should be the conflict resolution instrument. And usually the conflict resolution instrument comprise of local regulation and zoning, public hearing, environment impact assessment, license and permits, mitigation policies, compensation, and compulsory acquisition. Each of these methods have weaknesses. So one must look at, for my own country, this infrastructure, this location, what is best, what conflict resolution instrument should be used. And the idea is we want efficiency in terms of less time delaying the conflict so that we get to set up the infrastructure faster. Now, where NIMBY facilities affect health and human life, Bruno Frey, a 1996 paper, was the first paper to actually show that compensation by giving money to pay the local residents to accept the NIMBY would often be rejected because people think that it's bribing them. So you bribe me to give up, trade off part of my health and so on for money. So people don't like that and they reject. So compensation, while useful, has its drawbacks, its constraint. So you cannot just use money to pay for this. And there are, of course, in the literature, there are many other things to consider. For those of you who knows game theory, they will talk about dominant strategy, incentive compatibility, budget balancing, and so on and so forth. I won't go into this. But I think from the NIMBY literature, from what I read, is that the most useful method is, number one, to involve the stakeholders. Is when you don't involve them, you make decisions away from them, they distrust you. Secondly, do not be quick to come up with monetary compensation. Sometimes it could be just in-kind compensation. For example, I create more jobs. I give better lighting to the community. I find a better way, right, to enhance their livelihood. Number three, mitigation. So if I identify some of the harms done by this infrastructure, then I will find a way how to reduce that harm and assure the community. For example, if it's the air pollution harm, I will ensure the latest technology is used to reduce air pollution. There is a technology or there is manpower to monitor the pollution and so on. If there is some threats to life and so on, I'll make sure that hospitals are built and so on. This is a form of mitigation. And this mitigation tend to go well with the public. Then say, I come out and give you money. So stakeholders is I think the most important. And we need to ensure that everybody is a win-win. If they see only China is winning, then nobody will want to go and support, you see. And so I think China also realizes this. And so all stakeholders in the countries which benefit from this increased trade and improved connectivity, they build to ensure the success and requires low opposition to the projects, faster reaping of benefits, involvement of these stakeholders, win-win. And what does that mean? It means engagement. It means better sharing of benefits through maybe international policy dialogues, consultations, sharing information. And the other countries have a role to play in also strengthening their sustainable development through national and transnational legal framework. The banks also have a role to play about infrastructure financing, aligning the loans through greenery, sustainable development. Industry's role also have to play. Companies cannot just go in and say, I just import my own labor from China and build. I don't care about the local labor, and you're going to get lots of problems. Look at what happened to Malaysia, right? If a new government came in, the government looks at, well, most of these projects, the importation, the use of labor, where are the labor coming from, right? So you want the local population to have a stake in the infrastructure, in the program, or in the development. And of course, the scientific community, the educational community also have a role to play in terms of helping to assess data and analyze data and so on. These stakeholders in BRI is so important. You look at, there's so much diversity. We talked about 65 countries. There's a Silk Road Fund that comes from all this whole list of them. There's the AIIB, 45 Belt and Road Cooperation Agreement, 56 Trade and Economic Cooperation Zone, the World Bank's role, central banks, cooperation with provincial government, United Nations. So all these are stakeholders. There's so many stakeholders to look at. But ultimately, the most important thing I would say is trying to foster and encourage good local environmental management, which means proper utilization of inclusive CBA, getting the prices right. For example, China just announced plans to set up big data service platform on ecological and environmental protection. So this is announced. So this is trying to attempt that if we do CPA, the correct prices might be chosen. We have to look at externalities. We have to put a value on non-market goods. We try to expand market solution, get good baselines data. Don't have good data, cannot do any analysis, don't know what's happening. Damage schedules, pursuing green technology, and here again China has a lot of experience to show, and also capitalizing on the, as I said, the forerunners, Japan and some European countries, and working with stakeholders. My conclusion, there are many environmental and ecological impacts on BRI. They are inevitable. You cannot say we don't want, they are there. But to mitigate some of these harms and to encourage a win-win situation, one has to look at drawing techniques from economics, from cost-benefit analysis, EIA, environment evaluation, to inform policy making. Considerations must also be given, not just to mitigate this environmental impact or whatever impact, but also through adaptation. Just like we say, global warming impacts us, what are we going to do? Well, we have these international meetings, we talk about carbon tax, we try to price carbon. But we can't achieve this very fast, right? So it takes time. So what do? Then we have to adapt. It's the same thing here. We have some of these problems. That's how to mitigate, how to adapt is more important. So for example, like Singapore's case, we already increased rules for new buildings. The base level must be raised higher to try to prevent future flooding through sea level rise. Moving away activities near the coast to inland, right? Creation of more drainage. These are all the adaptation measures that we have taken in Singapore. So it's the same thing here. What kind of adaptation? People seldom talk about this, but I think it's important for short term, right? While we wait for long term. And then I think that the BRI is not just as simple as what some authors have said. It's just exporting all the dirty industries outside. It is not a pollution haven. And I'm sure China doesn't see it this way. And if the corporations were to see it this way, then I'm sure the Chinese would come down hard on them, as they are beginning to do now, because they realize that by building all this, opening these opportunities for improvement in standard of living, interconnectivity, economic benefits, right? The corporation's responsibility must be there. Otherwise, the shift of blame goes back to the Chinese government, and the government realizes it, and they have to monitor, they have to enforce some things from the corporations, right? So it's not just a simple case of pollution haven, exporting dirty industries overseas. It's not a case of Lawrence Summers' argument, the memorandum that was leaked years ago, right? So I believe that that if all this is handled properly, then most of the host countries would gain, and China would also gain by showcasing what it can do. But all this depends upon the few things, the problems that I talked about. And it's not just always talking about environmental sustainability things. It's not just about degradation. But one has to go back behind this. Before you build this infrastructure, have you done a proper cost-benefit analysis? Have you done proper accounting? Have you gone through the framework? Have you talked about NIMBY problems? How do you resolve the conflict resolution? What did you use? To me, all these are much more important. So while all these are going on, the parallel can take place, which is green financing, what the banks role, all these things can still take place. But it's like, don't put the cart before the horse, And arising from actually the US-China trade wars, the tariff wars, right? Actually, is actually helping China, because a lot of the companies, I understand, during my recent trip to China, are moving out of China and investing in the corridor and investing in Southeast Asia. So they have transferred a lot of their activities out. And this could potentially even magnify the spillover effects of the BRI. Okay, I think I want to stop here.